Well, coming up on today's show, a standard plug for EVs just got a big step closer. A major VW announcement, and the Tesla Semi facing a new wave of skepticism. That and more coming up today. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Hello and welcome to the Friday, the 24th of August edition of EV News Daily. It's Martyn Lee here with the news you need to know about electric cars and the move towards sustainable transport. Thank you to myev.com for helping us make this show. Well, they've built the first marketplace specifically for buying and selling and learning about electric vehicles. North America only at the moment, but a fascinating website to look at to go and see their idea of how you can buy and sell and learn about used EVs in a way that I think is very smart, very clever. Check out myev.com. And thank you to the many people that have asked how I am listening to the podcast, working out. Yes, been slightly poorly, and a third day of a sore throat, by the way. I'll give it another day, and if it's not clearing up, I'll head to the docs, because for some reason this isn't clearing up. Hopefully it's nothing more serious than simply a sore throat. Let's get into the news, and I'm going to start with what doesn't seem like a huge story. Trust me, I think this could be the very first time we hear about this story that we are still talking about in 5 years' time. And it's all about a unified charging socket. Japanese and Chinese industry groups today agreed to standardize the next generation of fast charging systems for EVs in an effort to jointly develop a single charger by 2020 that will fully charge an EV in less than 10 minutes, writes Yomiuri Shimbun for Japanese News. By joining hands, Japan and China will hold more than 90% of the market for fast chargers around the world and take a major step forward achieving a global standard. Well, the CHAdeMo Association, a group of auto and battery makers promoting Japan's fast charging standard, CHAdeMo, is expected to sign an agreement with the China Electricity Council in Beijing by the end of August this month. The CEC promotes China's standard. Now, that at the moment is called GBT. And if you didn't quite know how important GBT is to China, it's so dominant there that Tesla even changed their own proprietary plug when they sell their cars in China, so it's got the Chinese plug socket on. Well, Japan and China aim to commercialize a new system which is capable of producing 500 kilowatts of power. If the Japan-China team succeeds in establishing a global standard, it'll become easier for Japan to export EVs, benefiting battery makers that possess the advanced expertise in terms of production and sales. More than 80% of fast chargers around the world so far in 2018, that's about 220,000 units, are using China's GBT standard. So if China say, we're going to move to a new standard, if Japan brings their expertise from the CHAdeMo Association, that is a really powerful signal to the rest of the EV market. So, North America's kind of using a hybrid of different systems. Here in Europe, CCS is the one that the European Union has favoured, and a lot of the ultra-fast, the kind of 350 kilowatt chargers just starting to be rolled out, and the major routes around Europe are all CCS 2.0 plugs. People often say online, on Twitter, on social media, they say to me, which plug is going to win? And I always reply to them, why does there have to be a winner? Why can't it be like mobile phone networks, like cell phone networks? There's 3 or 4 of them. If this goes ahead in 2020, I would have to reverse my thinking on that and backtrack and say, if 90%, so if Japan and China, if 90% of the fast chargers are using a new plug developed by the Japanese, endorsed by the Chinese, the sheer scale of that would suggest to me that it stands a very good chance of being the de facto standard for EV charging going forward on a long term, on a 5 to 10 year term, as in just going forward. The kind of VHS versus Betamax, the Blu-ray versus HD DVD debate. It could well be that there is one winner, and that in 15, 20 years' time, that there is one dominant standard of charging, and it could well be this one. It's definitely a story that I think is worth keeping an eye on, and it won't be widely reported yet because there's really nothing else to report apart from the fact that by the end of this month they're going to have the agreement signed. The big launch, if they're aiming for 2020, will be further down the road. By then, you and I would already be clued up on what it really means. Well, if it hadn't been for that announcement about charging, this next story would easily have been the lead announcement. It was a big VW event that was happening today, and Volkswagen confirmed the launch of a new e-mobility car-sharing service in Berlin to start with. As the German automaker looks to move beyond traditional vehicle ownership, the VW brand, which makes up around half of the sales by the parent group, Volkswagen Group, said that 1,500 e-Golfs will be rolled out onto the streets of Berlin during the second quarter of 2019. According to CNBC, the company predicted a 15% annual growth here in Europe for on-demand vehicles. Car sharing's become a major play for auto firms recently, who predict that younger customers, especially those in cities, are less interested in committing to a large capital outlay for a car, says the CNBC article. And I would agree with that. So I work in the media industry in London, of course, the capital here in Great Britain. And I work in a media organisation. We own radio stations and TV stations. We make magazines as well, some of the biggest in the country. And I work with a lot of young, kind of media savvy people in their 20s. They wouldn't dream of having a DVD collection because of Netflix. They would never dream of having a CD collection because they got Spotify or Apple Music. They would never dream of buying a house because they're too expensive. And many of the early 20s people that I work with, by the way, just don't ever aspire to own a car, because with Uber, which is a big deal in London, Uber is their default service to save them time and to take them places. They will watch London black cabs with the light on drive past them whilst they're standing on the side of the road waiting for their Uber. That doesn't make any sense. They could have got an earlier taxi. But that's what young people... I'm 40, but that's what young people are doing now. When I go home, I live by the seaside. I live by the beach, which is 2 hours outside of London. And it's where I'm recording this podcast now. Life is very different. We're much more rural here. Cars are used much more for mobility. The idea of calling a taxi is fine, but it'll be a 10 or 15 minute wait. The idea of people giving up their car where I live is somewhat strange for anyone to get their head around. The car is an essential part of their freedom and their mobility. But I go to work, and in a very heavily built-up major city, one of the world's biggest capitals, and I can completely understand how not only self-driving cars, but certainly car sharing is going to be a really big deal very soon. In fact, it already is. As those kind of younger people get bigger jobs, more well-paying jobs, they'll just use cars for the time that they need them and never actually need to buy one. Well, whilst all of that got the headlines today, none of the really big kind of mainstream media picked up on two announcements today by Volkswagen, which I think are huge, and certainly from an EV world, they're huge, and it shows how little they understand the EV industry. The first one is that the ID, the Volkswagen ID, there's three of them. There's the ID Cross, and the ID Buzz. The ID was referred to today by Volkswagen in the press conference as the Neo. Now, I've only ever heard it called the Neo, which is basically the e-Golf, but don't call it an e-Golf, because it's not the e-Golf. It's definitely not the e-Golf. It's the Neo. I've only ever heard of it referred to that in a Bild article, German newspaper called Bild, in April, when they rumoured it to be called Neo. Since then, I've heard nothing. Now, I don't read every single article that's published on the internet every single day. I do my best, but I might have missed it. This is the first time that I think, that I know of, and I follow VW really closely, please correct me if I'm wrong, that they've ever, and it wasn't like a ta-da moment, they just referred to it as the Neo, and I'm like, is that an official announcement, or is that a slip of the tongue, or is that someone doesn't realise? I mean, I don't know. Let me know if you know more about this than I do. So, yes, the e-Golf that's definitely not, because the e-Golf is going, it's the Neo, which is the same size and the same shape and looks a lot like a Golf, but it's not a Golf. It is the ID, but it won't be called the ID. It'll be called the ID Neo, and then there'll be the Buzz and the Cross, which is the van, and the SUV or the CUV. So that's fascinating. The second big announcement is that there will be over-the-air updates for all Volkswagen electric cars, and actually a huge bit of news because I'm going to wheel out that well-worn analogy right now that EVs are basically computers on wheels. you do need those overnight software updates. You can't just release a car and then that's it now for the next 15 years of its life. It's never going to be upgraded. They need kind of nightly or weekly builds as they put new features, new feature sets in the cars. That's going to become increasingly more common and essential with electric cars. Autoblog did pick that up, in fairness to them. The new operating system is going to be called VWOS, that's original, which will be introduced in VW cars from 2020 onwards, rather than having around 70 different sensors, they say, and controllers operating independently within each vehicle. The new cars are going to connect the various sensors using new proprietary software and the new operating system. VW said it was easier to do over-the-air updates for cars if the OS was designed themselves, rather than depending on third-party software supplied by the different vendors providing all the various sensors. I'll put a link to those two articles in today's show notes. Well, Simon Alvarez at Teslarati's looking back at the claims at the Tesla Semi launch that Elon Musk noted the Tesla Semi would cost the operators of those trucks $1.26 per mile to run, much less than the standard $1.51 per mile of diesel-powered vehicles costing that for trucking in the USA. That said, Alan Schaefer. Now, Alan Schaefer is the executive director of the Diesel Technology Forum. It's a trade group. Alan's sceptical of Elon Musk's claims, noting that there is little need for a new entrant in the shipping industry. Oh, Alan, we respectfully disagree. He says this, and I quote, I'm quoting the executive director of the Diesel Technology Forum. We disagree fundamentally on many things. We'll be Alan's friend, won't we? Here on the podcast, you and I, we'll disagree with him, but we'll be his friend. And he says this, it's easy if you're coming into this market to say they're $1.50 per mile and we can do it for $1.20, but where's the proof? Asks Alan. I haven't seen it. Diesel is the benchmark for energy efficiency. Diesel dominates the sector. End quote. Oh, Alan, look, I've been doing this. I've been reading about EVs for a long time, and the podcast is relatively new, but I've been immersed in this world for a while. People listening to this podcast, some of them live and breathe electric cars as their actual day job. This is just my hobby. Alan, we've heard those kind of quotes from people like you for many years, and trust me, if you put your fingers in your ears and you deny that truck operators don't want trucks that cost $1.20, but they'd rather carry on paying $1.50 because there's an ideology behind diesel, Alan, my friend, you'll be looking for a new job very soon. Well, moving on, and EV Go was featured on this podcast on Saturday. Jonathan Levy was one of our very special Saturday special guest, and was a fascinating guest as well in giving us insight into the charging infrastructure and the future in North America. EV Go is America's largest public electric vehicle fast charging network, and they made a big announcement today. The company has already surpassed its record number of EV miles charged in 2017. And we're only halfway through 2018 in August. Well, EVgo fast-charged more EV miles than the entire year last year, illuminating a dramatic growth of EV miles travelled in the USA, driven largely by ride-share drivers using electric vehicles. Cathy Zoe is the CEO of EVgo, and Cathy said this, and I quote, "The number of EVs that accept fast charging is expected to quadruple over the next 2 years due to a very rapid increase in electric vehicle miles charged in 2018, led by rideshare segment. EVgo is accelerating our deployment of public fast charging and dedicated networks in collaboration with our partners," end quote. The key there for me is that it's ride sharing. It's people working in the gig economy, people who are maybe doing even a side hustle, driving. They finish their day job 9 to 5. They do a few hours in the evening doing some ride share, ferrying people around, and then they stop and do some fast charging on those EVgo chargers. That's just a fascinating bit of insight. There's a link to that article in the show notes if you're interested. Right, moving on to some spy shots. Ooh, I love a spy shot, especially when it's on the Nürburgring. Autoblog say that spy shooters recently caught the next-gen Kia Soul EV, wearing plenty of camouflage and showing bits and pieces of its new design. Spy shots of the next Kia Soul is testing at the Nürburgring, reports John Snyder for Autoblog. In the back, the lighting on the back of the Soul, which is a distinctive design, I think I'm being fair when I would call it that. On the back, the lighting starts really high, curves inwards like a big boomerang. It looks like Kia trying very hard as well to keep the rear of the car under wraps. so we might expect there to be other major design changes back there. We can't see from the photos any other clues about the electric powertrain. There's a good chance, though, the Kia Soul EV will use a powertrain and a version of the Hyundai Kona Electric's running gear. A link to that Autoblog article in the show notes. Well, a couple more stories that I want to get through today. By the way, a big thank you to all of the supporters on this podcast who, through Patreon, look after paying all the costs and the bills involved with this. Is patreon.com/EVNewsDaily. That is patreon.com/EVNewsDaily. I don't know if you've heard yesterday's podcast yet, but if you do, I was talking about a single street in London, and they were announcing that in this one street that petrol and diesel cars were going to be banned from it as a way of measuring pollution levels. And although it took a lot of criticism online when the announcement was made, I said wait, because once one road is banned, you just wait and see. Then it'll be 2, then it'll be 3, then it'll be a borough, and it'll be slowly. And I didn't expect it to be the very next day that we were reporting on this story. Petrol and diesel cars are going to be banned from 9 roads in London in a bid to tackle toxic air pollution. Drivers are going to receive a £130 penalty, that's about $160, if they use anything other than a pure electric or a hybrid car in areas known as Hackney and Islington from 7 till 10 in the morning and 4 till 7 at weekday afternoons, i.e. peak time, drive time. According to the London Evening Standard newspaper, the measures, which are introduced on September the 3rd this year, are the toughest restrictions yet on polluting vehicles in the capital. It came as a new medical report today said Londoners could live longer if toxic air is slashed. The EU legal limit for nitrogen dioxide is an annual average of 40 micrograms per cubic metre of air. This was breached at more than 50 monitoring sites in London last year. I can't tell you how bad the air in London is at the moment. It's just disgusting to work in London. I like to have a little bit of decompression time, so I get off the train, I have a 20-minute walk across town. I could get a bus or the tube, but I like to walk it. The last few days, I haven't checked the websites which report on pollution in London, and you can even check the daily air pollution figures. It just seems to me, and maybe it's because I'm ill at the moment and I've got this really bad sore throat and kind of finding it a bit harder to breathe as well. The pollution in London just seems to be horrific this week. It's been burning the back of my throat. And again, maybe it's because I'm ill, but it's been really horrible. Well, you wait ages for stories about ride sharing, and then they all come along at once. Grab is the latest transport operator to jump on the electric vehicle bandwagon. And they announced today that they've got a fleet of 200 electric vehicles, which are going to tap into the utility provider Singapore Power and their fast charging network. And it's going to be used for a fleet of car shares, reports Cynthia Chu in Today Singapore. Well, SP Group announced in June earlier this year it's going to be installing 500 new charge points, which will help this fleet of car sharing EVs across Singapore, across the island, from now to 2020. The first 30 will be operational by this year. Of the 500 charging points that Singapore's putting in, 100 of them are going to be the 50 kilowatt fast chargers. And what's a sign it is that we've come so far so quickly that when you read about 50 kilowatt DC fast chargers being installed, my first reaction is, it's a bit slow. Only a couple of years ago, it was like, lovely, great, fast chargers. And only a couple of years later, we're like, you're putting in 50 kilowatt ones? Wow, that's not very future-proofed. Good luck, Singapore. Okay, 2 more stories if my sore throat will get there. Firstly, Alex Ingram's verdict of the new Renault Zoe in Auto Express magazine is out. I saw it today. It's enormously complimentary. Let me read you a quick quote of it, but not too much, because obviously they want you to go and buy the Auto Express magazine or check them out on the website. But I will read you a quick quote. The updates to the Renault Zoe, the new R110 motor, bring a welcome dose of power, says Alex, while keeping the old car's usable range. Otherwise, it remains the same spacious, relaxing, all-electric super mini that it was before. It's worth sitting down to do some sums. The Zoe could save you money relative to established petrol or diesel-powered alternatives. Cars are more than good enough to be judged against. The extra performance hasn't harmed its range, a claimed range of 186 miles. That's 124 miles in cold weather, because if you didn't know, Renault with the Zoe give you 2 different ranges, hot weather, cold weather, because in the cold weather the battery performs a little worse. Same as before, on a dry August day, says Alex. The fully charged Zoe's trip computer predicted 160 miles of range, but our car was wearing the 17-inch alloy wheels, which trim a few miles from the potential. After the government's plug-in grant is taken into account, you can get a Renault Zoe in this country for £18,000. However, for that price, you don't quite own all of the battery. You do have a lease cost every month as well. To buy the battery outright costs you another £5,600. Now, if you are maybe listening to this, you're part of the Renault Zoe club, or you just know about these things, is there a new Zoe coming in October? Because I've heard a couple of rumours this week online. Some saying a larger battery, some saying the existing 40 kilowatt hour battery in the Renault Zoe, which, let's face it, is a big old battery for a small city car. With a 60 kilowatt hour battery, where would they put it? And, more importantly, a new design for a car that's been on the market 5-6 years now. One of our listeners tweeted me, actually, today to say that he thinks so. Do you know more? Let me know. You can email confidentially. Won't say your name on the air. hello@evnewsdaily.com. The email address is hello@evnewsdaily.com. Someone also suggested a surprise unveiling of the brand new Renault Zoe. Longer range, new design, Paris Motor Show, 4th of October. Is that true? Do you know? Let me know. I'll put a link to that Auto Express article in the show notes. And the final story today is all about the Nissan Leaf and exactly how cheap you can get one if you live in certain places. One thing that caught our attention, says Talk News, is that in many EV-targeted states like Massachusetts or Rhode Island, shoppers can get a brand new 2018 Nissan Leaf long-range battery for less than $17,000 after you factor in incentives. Well, in the Massachusetts and Rhode Island area, some dealers are working with Mass Energy's Drive Green initiative to advertise their discounted prices on EVs. Now, some of those discounts are $6,500 on the Leaf. So, you take the list price of, $32,000 for the Leaf, take off $6,500 for the Drive Green initiative, take off $2,500 for the state rebate, take off $7,500 for the federal tax credit, and the net result is a brand new Nissan Leaf that could cost you under $17,000 if you live there. If you're a podcast listener that lives there and you've done it or thought about it, get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. What a little announcement for our UK listeners that are maybe heading out over the bank holiday weekend. Yes, we're heading into a 3-day weekend, which is lovely. The Classic Car and EV show is at Blenheim Palace this weekend. If you fancy a little journey, August bank holiday weekend, Sunday it's going to be 10 till 4. Monday 10 till 4 as well. A range of electric vehicle exhibitors, companies and promoters. This groundbreaking content sits alongside the classic vehicle displays. There's going to be Teslas there, BMWs, Nissans, Porsches and many other EVs and hybrids. With the latest models on display, test drive facilities available and knowledgeable electric vehicle owners and drivers on hand to talk through their experiences of owning and driving an EV, all the latest developments and an EV zone at the Festival of Transport. It's the ideal opportunity to get up to speed with new technology. So if you are EV curious and you want to go along, maybe you couldn't make Fully Charged live earlier this year. I'm not suggesting this is on the same scale, but some very passionate and knowledgeable owners exhibiting their own cars that will be very happy for you to go up and have a little chit-chat with them and ask some questions. Blenheim Palace this bank holiday weekend here in the UK. Well, I want to say a very heartfelt thank you to 2 new Patreon supporters that have joined the gang. I was enormously grateful to our first fantastic 50 supporters, and we're working our way towards our hot 100 now. I think we're up to 65 Patreon supporters. Gethin Reese is a new producer of this show. Gethin, thank you so much. And hello to Tim Benford. Tim Benford, you're a star and new producer of this podcast, of which there are 220 previous episodes. If you would like to download them, you can do online right now. iTunes, Google Play, Google Podcasts. They're on Spotify. If you use Spotify for your music, they're on there as well. TuneIn, Stitcher. The audio goes on YouTube and the blog, which is evnewsdaily.com. I thought I'd mention a little search facility I've added to the blog, which is evnewsdaily.com. If there's anything that you want to look up that you've heard me talk about, that you are curious, that you think, oh, what was that? More detail. The show notes are pretty comprehensive, if I'm honest with you, and I've put a search bar at the top of the website, and if you want to search something like Kona It'll bring all the articles, all the podcasts up. You can listen to them again. You can look through the show notes. And if you want to, they are all on there, the entire archive, for free, because I love you long time. If you want to leave a little message, a rate and review on those platforms, it would be amazing. And if you want to catch up on the socials, just on Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn, search EV News Daily. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you tomorrow.